Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and thank you for watching IT Pro TV, helping you level up with IT learning everywhere you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus, securing apps with AppArmor. Do you want to do that? I think you do. And Don Pizzetta is here to show us more. Don, good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, glad to be here. And, we're continuing our Linux security journey as we go through some of the different ways of hardening a Linux install and just the basic cybersecurity practices that we all need to be implementing. And in this episode, what we're going to do is take a look at a very specific technology, and that is AppArmor. You'll see some similarities with some of the other things we've covered, like SE Linux, but AppArmor is a really neat suite of utilities that is built into several Linux distros that allows you to secure applications. So in this episode, we're going to see how to configure AppArmor, how to make sure it's working and get it enabled and functioning and protecting a system. So that's all coming up right here in this episode.
Well, Don, how is AppArmor different from SE Linux?
All right, so they are two different competing products. You're going to run one or the other. You're not really going to run both, or I guess some people run neither if you want to go that way. But SE Linux, the security enhanced Linux, that's the default in Red Hat and CentOS and Fedora, the Red Hat based distros, and it was originally developed by the NSA. Now, it's incredibly secure. It's very, it locks your system down, but many people don't trust the NSA, and it's always good to have choices. And so that's where AppArmor comes in. AppArmor is very similar to SE Linux. It defines a whole set of rules that dictate what an application is allowed to do. Is it allowed to access this file or that file? Is it allowed to have these ports open on the network card and so on, just like SE Linux does. All right. The main differences are AppArmor is the default in Debian-based distros. So if you're running Debian or Ubuntu or Linux Mint, they're usually running AppArmor. You can change them. You can disable AppArmor and add SE Linux, or disable SE Linux and add an AppArmor. So you can switch between them. One of the biggest differences, though, there's really two big differences, I guess. With SE Linux, Red Hat has done a great job of writing policies to restrict every process that runs on the system. AppArmor, on the other hand, is a little more targeted. With AppArmor, you create profiles that are focused on individual apps. So I might have AppArmor just protecting one app. You really wouldn't do that with SE Linux. You could, but that's not the default way. With AppArmor, we can protect the entire system, but that's kind of not how it's rolled out by default. The other thing is with SE Linux, it is an incredibly high level of security. It's actually looking at the inodes on the disk where data is stored and controlling access either from the applications as they launch or what the applications are trying to access. AppArmor, on the other hand, just uses path names. All right. Now, by using path names, it means AppArmor is more efficient. It creates less load on your system. Both systems create a pretty low load. I don't normally worry about it, but AppArmor is more efficient than SE Linux. But the trade-off is it's using file paths. And file paths can be manipulated, can be altered and changed and things like that to make it where there's potential ways to bypass it. Not from within AppArmor itself. So as long as you're protecting an app, you're pretty secure. But if somebody's already operating outside of AppArmor, then it starts to kind of fall apart. So a little bit of a trade-off there. And you kind of have to make a choice over which one you want. They're both great products. So I don't want to pitch one as necessarily better than the other. But they do function a little bit different. But when properly configured, at the end of the day, they both operate the same way. They're taking applications and just controlling what resources they have access to. Now, if you're operating in an all Red Hat environment, you need to learn SE Linux. If you're operating in a all Debian or Ubuntu environment, you need to learn AppArmor. But I encourage people to learn both because you never know what systems you'll encounter as you move around out there in the real world.
Well, how do we know if we're running AppArmor?
All right, so I gave you kind of the basic rule of thumb that if you know it's a Debian-based distro, then you've got that. But what if it's a customized distro, a third-party one, or you're just remoting into a server for the first time and you don't see any identifier there to tell you? Well, you can check really easily. There's a couple of ways. Let me show you. Probably the easiest way. I'm on a CentOS machine here, which is not running AppArmor. And there's a simple command we can run, which is AppArmor, whoops, we do have to spell it right, AppArmor _status, all right? And if you run that command, well, you'll probably see what I'm getting right here, command not found. If the command doesn't even exist, then you're not running AppArmor, okay? But just because the command exists doesn't mean you're running it either. You might have AppArmor installed but not activated. It could be disabled, right? So let me jump over to an Ubuntu system. So this one's running Ubuntu. And I did a default install here. I haven't manipulated anything. Well, the only thing I manipulated was the font size of this terminal window so we could read it. But other than that, it's a default install. And so if I run that same AppArmor underscore status command, this time I get a little more information. It's telling me the AppArmor module is loaded. So it's installed and it's loaded. It's actively running, so I can verify that it's there. Now, I'm not an administrator, so that's all I get, is just the information that it is running. If I were to sudo that and run it, now I get a lot more information. I actually see the policies that are being put in place to protect the system. And it says 38 profiles are loaded, and that loosely matches to apps. Like 38 different apps are being protected on this system. So I know AppArmor is running, I know it's doing its job, and it's up and going. Now, if it wasn't, so let's say that I ran AppArmor underscore status and it gave me a command not found. Okay, well, I could install AppArmor from inside of whatever repository I've got. So for example, if I were to do a sudo apt list AppArmor star and go and hunt for some packages, you'll find where there's the AppArmor package itself right there. So you can install that package and now you're back up in business. And you'll find that under Red Hat systems too. Like you can actually go and install AppArmor if you want. And then there's a few other packages here, two that are really important. One is this guy right here, AppArmor-profiles. In order to protect an app, we have to have a profile. And this is the default profile set that Ubuntu ships out. So if you're just installing AppArmor, you're not going to have the profiles. So you'll have it, it'll be running, but no apps will be protected. And you can install this package to be able to get some basic protection. And then lastly, down here at the bottom, AppArmor-utils. This one's an optional one, but they're utilities, they're tools that we can use to configure AppArmor. If you're just trying to protect something that's one of the default profiles, you don't really need the utilities. You can just use those default profiles and you're in business. But if you've got an app that you need to create a custom profile for, or you want to tweak and modify the way that it works, some of the utilities that are in that package are really, really handy. So if you're going to install AppArmor, those three packages right there, the AppArmor package, AppArmor-profile, and AppArmor-utils, you'll install those, and then you're up and running with AppArmor. You just have to get in and get that kind of set up for your environment.
So Don, how is AppArmor configured?
All right, the configuration's a lot like any other Linux or Unix service that's out there. It's got config files that are stored in /etc. The main thing when you're configuring AppArmor is you're going to be working with those profiles, right? So when I ran AppArmor_status, it told me that I had 38 profiles, okay? And looking at the profile list here, it's basically giving me a list of applications that are protected. So for example, right here, the very first one, /sbin/dh client, right? That's the DHCP client. That's a service. It runs, it has to talk to the network, right? So it reaches out to the network, it finds a DHCP server, it gets an IP address, and then it's got to turn around and write that to the network adapter's configuration file. So the network adapter will know what IP address it has, and then off it goes. Or at a minimum, just make a note to say the network adapter is using DHCP. So those are some of the different things that DH client needs to be able to do. Well, from this screen, I just see that that application is protected. But if you look at the name of the application and take the full path, like this one is /sbin/dh client. If you replace the slashes with a dot, so like sbin.dh client or user.bin.events, those will be file names that'll correspond to a configuration file that we can find right inside of /etc. So let me show you where those are. If you go into /etc and take a look in here, you'll find a folder called AppArmor.d, right? And that's where the application configuration files for AppArmor are stored. So I'm going to get into that folder, AppArmor.d. And when you take a look, see how there's the usr.bin.events, like I mentioned, and sbin.dh client. These are all just text files, okay? And they're just taking the full path of the application name and replacing the slashes with dots. Well, except for the first slash, because if you put a dot at the beginning of the file, it'll be hidden, right? So that they don't do that one. But all the other ones, they just put a dot in there. The reason they're doing this is remember that AppArmor is based on path names. We're protecting the application in this particular path. I might have more than one copy of that binary. And it might be protected different ways depending on where it's stored. And I know that sounds odd, but think about like a CH root jail. That if I create a jailed environment for an application, it might have its own copy of Bash. It might have its own copy of FTP or whatever, various services and so on that are in that jail. Well, that jail technically has a different path than what we have here, and it might just be linked to the main location, but we can still protect it based on the path that a user is executing from. So that's what we're seeing right here. It's not unusual to see an application listed more than once with a different path. In my case, since this is a clean install, I don't see any duplicates here. But if we take a look at like sbin.dh client, let me just less that file, and we'll pull up its profile. Now, I didn't create these profiles. These were part of the default. So we'll create one a little bit later. But when we go in here and take a look at it, what you're going to see is a fairly well-documented file. If you really want to dig into this, you can pull up the AppArmor webpage, and they have documentation that goes on and on and on about it. But really what the file boils down to is a list of what the application is allowed to do. And most of it kind of stands out. You'll see where it has a capability for network binding. In other words, it can bind itself to the network adapter in order to communicate. We want that, right? And it's able to do raw communications. DHCP has to do a raw communication because it doesn't have an IP address yet. So it doesn't really have like layer 3 and higher data in the OSI model. It's really just operating at layer 2 as it broadcasts out trying to find an address. You'll see other things like the ability to generate packets so that it can communicate. And as you keep going down, you'll see just more and more information that's all dictating what that application is allowed to do. And a lot of it will use wildcards, and that's because the path that it might have might change based on various scenarios. But you'll see each of these down here, like the ability to write to the configuration of Network Manager, right? DHCP needs to be able to deal with that. And you'll see over here on the side whether they've got read access or write access or both, right? All kind of setting the boundaries for that application. So when it comes to configuring AppArmor, it's these profiles that you're normally going to be manipulating. AppArmor itself just runs and it reads all these profiles into RAM and it starts working with them. So I can make changes here to either add permissions or take permissions away, and that's going to further restrict that application and, in theory, further restrict the application. Remember that what this is protecting us from, let's back up a bit because I haven't really talked about the problem. The problem is if an attacker is targeting my system, right, they're going to go through a couple of steps. The first step is they find the system. And the second step is they're going to enumerate my services. They're going to figure out what services I'm running, okay? And once they figure that out, right, and you can do like a netstat or an ss-an, and you'll get a list. So, sorry, the command I'm running here is the ss or socket status -an. That's the replacement for netstat. We used to just run netstat-an. And I'm saying -a, show me all of the sessions on my system. And N is telling it not to do DNS lookups, just to do numbers so it runs a little faster. And what this does is it gives me a list of all the programs that are running on my system that are holding a port open. And what I'm really looking for are the ones that are listening. So if I scroll back up towards the top, I probably could have grepped this to save some time. Somewhere up here, we'll start to see ones that are listening. Most of these are established. We're already communicating on these. But the ones that are listening are the ones that an attacker can find. And then they can look at it and say, oh, looks like you're running an FTP server. So maybe I can try some of these FTP exploits and break into your system. Or here, I finally got to where, like, here's SSH is up and going, and it's listening on a port. You've got, other services like that. Most of them are using well-known port numbers. Some are using custom port numbers. It just kind of depends on what it is. That instance of SSH was on a non-standard port. So as we look through, we'll find others. Well, with AppArmor, it's saying, okay, I can't stop an attacker from finding a port. If I'm running a web server, I have to have port 80 open because that's what people expect it to be on, and an attacker will see port 80. And then if they attack, maybe they have an exploit for Apache, and so they're able to compromise the web service. All right, so AppArmor can't really stop that either. You either update Apache or you don't. If you haven't done your updates, then it's vulnerable. But even if it is updated, maybe there's a 0 day, and an attacker is able to take advantage of that. So assuming we can't stop those things, what next? That's where AppArmor comes in. AppArmor says, okay, let's just assume that Apache is going to get hacked, or the DHCP client is going to get hacked, or my MySQL, or whatever other service it is that I'm running that's listening, it's going to get hacked. Then AppArmor says, let's limit what that attacker can do. Without AppArmor, if an attacker gets control of Apache, they'll typically be able to do privilege escalation and then have root access to the whole rest of your system. And they can affect any other service that you're running on the system and access the hard drive and do all sorts of stuff. They would then have full control over that system. But with AppArmor, it's like building walls around them. And it's saying, all right, yeah, you got Apache, you got it. And now you can do the things that Apache does, but you can't mess with the rest of the system. Apache can't create a user account. But if an attacker breaks into it and nothing stops them, they can escalate privileges and start creating user accounts. AppArmor won't let them do that. So that's kind of how it's protecting it. And that's what we're finding in all of these profiles is just a listing of these are the applications and here's what they're allowed to do normally. If they try and do anything else, we're going to just shut them off and not let them communicate. So that's where the bulk of our various settings are going to be. And then when we take these profiles, we can turn them on or you can turn them off, right? It's got a couple of different modes that it operates in. And one mode is called complain and one mode is called enforce. You know, you ever hear somebody say, oh, you can't complain?
Yes.
Well, AppArmor can. And so when it's in complain mode, what it does is it says, I've got all these rules, but I'm not going to enforce them. I'm not going to put them in action. If somebody breaks the rules, we're going to generate a log message. And so when you're configuring this for the first time, it's pretty useful to turn this on and put it in complain mode just to see how everything's running, right? And then you can flip to the other mode, which is enforce. And in enforce mode, it logs activity that's not supposed to be happening, and it also prevents it. It stops it. It puts people in that little boundary. So these profiles can be applied either way. And I moved a little quickly at the beginning of the episode when I ran AppArmor_status, but it actually showed me in there when it was showing all these profiles. The first block here says there's 38 profiles, 36 of them are in enforce mode. These are actually turned on and doing their job. And then down here towards the bottom, I can see 2 more profiles are in complain mode. These are just watching and they'll generate log messages if something crazy happens. And these are both OpenOffice and that's because, or LibreOffice. And that's because LibreOffice does a lot of crazy things. It reaches out, it has a lot of different pieces to it. And so they didn't want to be too restrictive on that and potentially break it. So you may choose to tighten that up or not. So that's all kind of structured right in there. And that's how the basic configuration of AppArmor works.
Well, are there any global settings or is everything done per app?
You know, for most people, it's just going to be per app. You're going to go in and do it that way. But there are some global settings that you can kind of tweak. You know, looking around in this directory, there's a lot of other things. You know, mostly we focus on these application profiles, right? But on the left side here, you can see a few directories. And one of the directories is labeled tunables. If you go into tunables, these are ways that we can tweak the behavior of AppArmor. And these are a little more global, right? These are applying to the AppArmor process itself. And so if you look around in there, you'll see different things like aliases. It even has some special settings that apply to things like Dovecot, which is an IMAP server, and kernel variables and so on. User home directories, you can tweak how they're being kind of restricted. Remember that AppArmor is really designed to protect apps, not necessarily files, but you can use it to kind of govern how your home directories are accessed by governing the user shell and how the shell is allowed to access that. So there's some kind of interesting stuff that you'll find in there, but these are kind of the global tunables. And I'll be honest with you, most people never have to tweak these. There's not a lot of good reason to get in there, but if you ever need to, that's where they're found.
So Don, which applications do we need to secure? Probably all of them, right?
Yeah, really. the more the better, right?
Yeah.
But at a minimum, if we wanted to try and keep it as small as possible, any application that's listening on a network port,
Oh, sure.
right? If it's not listening on a network port, an attacker can't get into it via the network, right? They can get into it once they've compromised the system, but you're already compromised at that point, so what's the matter, right? We need to secure any application that has open ports on your network adapter, right? Now, I used the SS command a moment ago, and that works, right? But, I mean, you get a lot of stuff when you look in there. AppArmor actually has an extra command that helps you spot these. When you have an application that's not protected, AppArmor calls that a unconfined application. We haven't restricted that application yet. So there's a utility, and you might not have this one. In fact, I don't know if I have it or not. So I'm going to run AA-unconfined. All right. Remember the AppArmor-utils package I mentioned earlier? This is in that utils package. So if it doesn't run for me, yeah, I need to install it. And it actually just gives you the command to run right there. So that saves a little bit of time. and I'm going to go ahead and get that installed. And the utilities package is really small. It's like 1 megabyte or something. And once it's installed, I'll have that AA-unconfined command. And so I'm going to sudo AA-unconfined. And that's going to run. And it's going to look for any applications that I'm running that are listening on a network port and are either not protected or are being protected. It'll actually list confined ones too. So looking at the list, like right off the bat, I see systemd-networkd, my main network daemon, is currently not confined. Well, that's because it's the network daemon. It's what's making the network adapter work. We don't normally lock that down. Remember, we're focused on applications. So as I continue to look down, I can see some other things like cups, which is my print system, right? The common Unix print system, I believe is what that stands for. And it is installed by default. And so Ubuntu or the team at Canonical has gone ahead and secured that by default. So I can see that it's being enforced. And so it is protected. And we saw the configuration file for it a moment ago. But down a little bit later, I can see that I'm running Apache, all right, which I'm kind of surprised to see because I don't remember installing it. Remember, I said this was a default install. So apparently I must have installed it. This is an opportunity to see, here's some software I didn't even realize was there. If I didn't realize Apache was there, have I taken the time to secure it? Probably not. It's probably just running the test page, right? If we fire up old Firefox and I'll browse to my own system because I genuinely didn't know I was running Apache. So running that AA unconfined command helps us not only to discover apps we didn't know about. Yeah, I'm running and it's the default page. So not only do we discover those apps, but we also just see any that we haven't protected yet. So right here, right off the bat, I know I've got a problem. I've got Apache running and it's not protected. So I need to get that protected. All right. Anything that pops up in there, those need to be your targets. That needs to be what you're working for. And a lot of times you'll find where there's already a profile. And if that's the case, you just need to enable it. But if there isn't, that means we're going to have to write a profile and get it configured and set up for that application.
So how do we enable AppArmor for an app?
All right. So step one, we need to find out whether or not we've already got a profile for it. So I'm gonna go back to /etc/AppArmor.d. Okay. And I'm going to take a look in there and just see if I've got a, one defined for Apache. Now, I'm kind of lucky that right up here I've got the path. So I know the file I'm looking for. I'm looking for usr.bin.apache or Apache2. And so looking at my list here, or sorry, it's usr.sbin. And I do not have a usr.sbin.apache2. Okay. If you don't know the path, though, then you can use the which command to save a little bit of time. So, for example, I could say which Apache2, and it will tell me that if I execute the Apache2 command, here's where it can be found.
And that's which, not which.
Yeah, WHICH for our listening viewers. Sorry about that. So we can find it pretty quick, and then we can get that profile created, right? In my case, I don't have a profile. So step one for me is going to be to create it. If there was a profile, this would be easy. I just need to enable it. I might need to review it and tweak it a little bit, but otherwise you just turn it on. In my case, I've got to create one, all right? If you're going to create one, you absolutely need the AppArmor-utils. I shouldn't say absolutely. You could write it from scratch. So if you had it all memorized and knew the format, you could write it from scratch. I don't. So in my case, I'm going to use the AppArmor-utils package because it's got a nice little utility in there called AA-genprof. Genprof. It stands for generate profile. So it'll actually generate a profile for me. And the way it works is you run it, which I need to sudo this. So I'm going to run AA-genprof, and then you tell it the name of the application. So in my case, the application is called Apache 2. And so I'm going to run that. Okay. Now, at this point, it starts watching my system, and it's watching that process for Apache 2. See how it says profiling /user/sbin/Apache 2. Now, while this is running, okay, while it's running, I need to go and run that application through its paces, do the things that application normally does. So I'm going to open up another tab. And in my other tab, I'm going to do some of the normal things. So I'm going to, first I'm going to restart Apache. Because when it loads, it's got to read its configuration files, right? So I'm going to do a sudo systemctl restart Apache 2. And so that's going to restart it. It'll shut it down. It'll start it up. So now it's seeing, what does Apache do when it shuts down? What does Apache do when it starts up? So it sees that. Then I'm going to fire up a web browser, and I'm going to browse to my local host, right? Which is just going to pull up that default page right now. And maybe I'll browse to a page that doesn't exist. And by doing that, I generate an error message. Now it's read from the error message directory. So it's
Okay.
doing the things that it normally does. I would also need to browse from a network location because right now it's just seeing local communication. So I need to browse from the network. So that way, again, it's seeing all the stuff that Apache does. All right. And when I'm done with that, when I've run it through a couple of examples of what I expect for Apache, I can go back over here to my screen and I can hit S to scan. And when you hit S, it's going to look through all of the access logs, and then it's going to show me some of the things that Apache did. And I can then choose to allow or deny them as I move through, right? Maybe it is something that I want, or maybe something happened that really shouldn't have been allowed, and I can deny it. For most of us, we're just going to be allowing, right? So I can see that it used the net bind service. All right, it's got to bind to a network adapter, so I'll allow that, right? And then it looked into pulling up some dovecot and postfix mods, as well as using the set GID or set group ID command. And that's because Apache runs under its own group. So I'll go ahead and allow that. We see a little bit more of that here for another module. Looks like it is calling into the name service and reading /etc/gai.conf. Notice it's just got read access. There's that R right there, not read write. I could go and add read write later on if I just missed it, but in my case, this is all I want. So I'll go ahead and add that. And we just kind of keep going through like that, authorizing it. There it just read its config file /etc/apache2/apache2.conf. It needs to be able to read that, the module directory, and so on. So these are all the different activities. And I'm going to hit A a bunch here, or I could do the global setting, I guess. But basically, I'm just going to kind of cruise right through this, right? So when it's done, once we get through all of that, now we've approved everything it's going to do. I can just save those changes, right? And then I can hit F to finish. And when that's done, it creates a profile for me. So now if I take a look inside of /etc/AppArmor.d, and I look in here, I can find usr.sbin.apache2. So it's created that profile that lists just what Apache needs to do for normal operations. If a hacker breaks in and tries to do something crazy, well, it's not supported, and so it's going to be blocked, and it won't be able to get out. All right. So I've created the profile. Next, I need to do a few more things. In order for Apache to work with AppArmor, they actually have a module for that. So I need to install it. Not every application has this, so you can skip the step for a lot of things, but Apache does have a specific module. How do I know that? Now, I know that because I've read the documentation, right?
Because you're smart.
If you didn't know that, though, the GenProf utility will actually tell you.
Yeah.
If you take a look at that text file, so I'm going to do a less on usr.sbin.apache2 and take, whoops, I got to sudo that, and take a look in here. It gives you a lot of information about what happened, right? What was accessed and so on. And, actually it didn't tell me, did it? A lot of times it will actually tell you right in here, oh, here's this extra step that you need to do and go through. And it might have had it on the screen and I ignored it. I'm going to scroll back a little bit and see if it popped up here. No, it didn't. All right. Well, on some distros, apparently not this one, it'll actually give you a warning about, other things that you might need to add. In my case, it didn't. So I'm going to go ahead and just install the package I know I need. So I'm going to say sudo apt install lib apache2 and -mod -AppArmor. All right. So it has a module to install that will specifically add that support for AppArmor. So I'm going to punch that one in there. And had I done that beforehand, it probably would have helped with the discovery as well too. The order can matter on some of these things. But I've got it in there. Next, I need to enforce the policy. So if a policy had already existed or a profile had already existed, I could have skipped all that stuff and jumped right to here. But in my case, I had to create the profile. Now I'm ready to turn it on. And we do that by saying sudo aa-enforce, and then we specify the profile. So I'm going to say /etc/AppArmor.d /usr.sbin.apache2. So just pointing to that profile, and my head's covering that up a little bit, but basically just pointing directly to where that profile file happens to reside. And when I run that, that's going to turn it on and put it in enforce mode. Now, I used AA-enforce. There's also AA-complain if I want to go into the complain mode, and AA-disable if I want to turn it off. So maybe I just broke something and it's not working. I can real quick do AA-disable or AA-complain so that it'll start working again, but I can look at the logs, and in the logs, I can figure out what I missed. What did I miss? What commands are being run that are erroring out? And you can use that to kind of tweak the profile. From this point, the profile has been made. So if something gets broken, you can just go and edit the profile. It's just a text file, and you can go in and you can add the things that are missing. You don't have to run genprof again, unless you really want to. But if you missed it the first time, you'll probably miss it the second time too. Usually better to edit that file. So you can always take a look at it. Now, it's not actually taking effect just yet until I restart Apache. So I'm going to do a sudo systemctl, restart Apache 2. And so that's going to run. And then I'm going to do a sudo AppArmor _ status. Sorry, I want to do, not that one. I want AA-unconfined. I just want to make sure that it's actually being enforced at this point. And so now I can see it right here, those 3 instances of Apache. Apache spins up multiple threads, and so we're seeing it here. And so I see it is enforcing, and it is now protected. And actually, you know, the AppArmor _ status, I could have seen it here too. It's just a little harder because it gives you that list right here. Now I've got 40 profiles in enforce mode. I had 38 earlier. And as I scroll down, I should be able to find right here, /user /sbin /Apache 2. So there's its little entries. It's now being protected.
Don makes it look easy, doesn't he? Securing apps with AppArmor, another wonderful episode inside the CompTIA Linux Plus series. But before we move on, I think you have something else you'd like to say.
Yeah, you know, remember the AppArmor, it's great. It protects apps. It does a wonderful job. And it's kind of the de facto standard in that Debian and Ubuntu world. Over in the Red Hat, CentOS, Fedora world, it's SE Linux. They're 2 competing products. You don't want to run both of them at the same time. That's bad news. Pick one or the other. But they're both perfectly adequate. And I encourage you guys to learn them both because all too often I hear about people where they go and work on a system they're not familiar with and they say, oh, I don't know SE Linux. Let me just turn it off. Or I don't know AppArmor. Let me just turn it off. And that's a really, really bad idea. Take the time to learn it. Keep it on, because it will protect you from a large number of attacks that are out there. It's some of the most useful security software we can configure.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for the entire series of CompTIA Linux Plus that you also should be watching, and hopefully at this point you have been. It will help you now and in the future, and keep studying. There's supplementary information in our course library that can only do one thing, help you be even more successful, so check that out as well. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is binge-worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.